Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to look at turning Interlok into a web server. Now, hopefully you already know that Interlok can consume information from various different data sources, process that data as a message, and then output it to one or many destinations. But what we're going to do now is show you how to create a basic HTTP server that takes GET requests and provides an output through a normal web browser. To do this, we're going to use Jetty, which provides the HTTP connectivity that we need. Then we're going to turn a normal HTTP request into a message and process it. So here's our dashboard. Our Interlok instance is started, but there are no channels. So let's go and have a look at the config, which, as you can see, is empty. So the very first thing we need to do is create a channel. Now, there's nothing complicated about what we're going to do today. It's just a standard channel. And we're going to call that HTTP. I'm going to enable the advanced options here. We don't need them for this, but personally I enable advanced options by default. The choice is up to you. So we're now automatically given two connections, the consume connection on the left and the produce connection on the right. Let's swap out this null connection for Jetty, a Jetty embedded connection. And here it is. We'll call that Jetty. Other than that, you can leave the settings as their default. Now, we're not going to change the produce connection. Why is that? Because the output is going to use the same connection as the input. That is, it's not going to make a new connection to go outbound. If for whatever reason we wanted to transfer the HTTP request that we get to a different system, then yes, we would need an output. But just to respond to the browser, we use the same connection as the inbound. Now we're missing a workflow, so let's add that. Again, standard workflow. There it is. And we're going to call this one API because that's what the web server is going to provide. It's going to provide an API as opposed to, say, a web browser, a web server which provides web pages, HTML pages, and images, and JavaScript. We're just going to output a single bit of information, and that's what an API is good for. Now the consumer, we've got a Jetty embedded connection, so we need to swap this consumer out for a Jetty counterpart. And there's our Jetty message consumer. The only thing you need to do here is change the destination. For our little mini API, we need to accept HTTP requests on a given endpoint. For that, we're going to use /API. So anything that comes after the second slash, where the star is going to be used in a moment. I'll show you how. Let's save that. As far as the producer goes, this does need to be different. Even though it's still a null connection, we need to swap that out for a Jetty standard response producer. And there it is. Now, most of these can be left the same apart from the status provider. And the HTTP configured status here, what we need to do is use a bit of metadata, which we'll come to later, and I'll show you how to set that up. And we want OK. There's OK 200. So we're going to use the response code later. So we're just setting it up for now and save that. So at the moment, what would happen is that a HTTP request would come in, it would be processed, it would be accepted, but not processed because we have no services, and then a response would be outputted. But that's not much help. What we need to do is you do something with the HTTP request that we've been given. So what we need to do is work out how we're going to process it. And with Interlok, if then else's are handled by branching service collections. So here's our branching service collection. This will determine, based on the request, how to handle the message. We're going to call this HTTP routing. If you haven't used branching service collections before, the very first thing that it does is route the message to another service, which will decide how to process the message. We are simply encapsulating all of those services in a branching service collection. So the very first service ID will be called HTTP routing service. Let's save that. So there's our branching service collection. If we maximize that, enlarge it, you can see that the service collection itself is empty. But we know what our first service ID is going to be called. And when we add it as a Jetty routing service, see that the unique ID has already been populated by Interlok. It knows that the first ID has already been set up this way, so it provides the unique ID by default. Now, the default service ID, we're going to be a bit pessimistic and assume that if you haven't got your HTTP request exactly right, then you've got it wrong. And for that, we're going to use the service ID. We're going to create a service called 404. If you know your HTTP codes, you'll know that 404 means not found. So unless you get the HTTP request just right, you're going to encounter a 404, which is how it is in the real world. Now, under root, this is where it gets interesting, because what we're telling it is how to handle the HTTP request that comes in, what to do with it, how to route it. So if we create a Jetty route spec, our method is get. Obviously, we could have post as well, or head, or whatever HTTP command you want. But in this case, we're just going to use standard get. And the URL pattern, at the beginning, under the Jetty message consumer, we set it up as /API. So we're going to carry on with that, /API. But now we're going to introduce a sub endpoint, and we're going to call it name. Give another slash, and then we're going to create a little bit of regex, because everyone needs regex in their life. And what this does is it will take in a web browser anything with the URL /API/name/something, and it will give that something the metadata key name. And if it does that successfully, it's going to go to a service called success. So let's save that. And that's the very first thing that's happened. Let's just look at that again. By default, if we have not provided a valid HTTP request, then it will go to a service we'll create in a minute called 404. If it gets it right, if you've put in a URL with the correct syntax, then you've got /API/name/something, then it will send that message to a service called success with a metadata key called name. The key will be name, and the value will be whatever comes after /API/name here. Okay, so let's create those two services. First of all, let's be optimistic. Let's assume that we're going to get the right sort of HTTP request. So we need a payload from metadata service, because the HTTP request as it comes through as a get doesn't contain any information apart from those in headers, and they get transferred to metadata. So in this case, payload from metadata service. We're going to turn the metadata into payload from metadata. We're going to give it the unique ID success that we've already defined, and then we're going to create a little bit of XML, because we're creating a small web-based API. We'll just call it XML, and we'll say, I'd like to know what the name is, please, the name that you supply. And I'd also like to find out a little bit more information, like what was the URL that was called to get this web service. Now we're going to do a bit of find and replace now, and we do that by creating a string there. Up to you what you put here. but we tend to find that the sort of double underscores are unlikely to be used anywhere else. So they're not strings that will accidentally be matched. And that's what we've done here. But we still need to find the values to put there. So here's our name. And here's our URL. I've actually made a slight mistake there, because name is a metadata key that we've provided. We put that in at the beginning. We put that in the Jetty routing service to say that anything that came after /API/name, the value of that goes into the metadata key name. But URL doesn't come from anywhere. So what have we done? Well, what we need to do is in fact use metadata that's already been provided. And some metadata is provided by Jetty. So Jetty URL, we haven't defined that. That's defined by Jetty. And it reacts to the HTTP GET request and puts the value into puts the value into Jetty URL, which we then replace in this predefined XML string. So anything that's __URL will be given the value that's in Jetty URL, and anything where it matches __name _ will be given the value that is in the metadata key name. Let's save that. Now finally, we've got to add the service which we reach if things go wrong. And for this, we're just going to do an add metadata service. There it is. We're going to call it 404 because that's what we're reporting. And we're going to give it the metadata key of response code with the value 404. Now remember that we set up response code right at the beginning, and that is used by the Jetty standard response producer. So if the response code exists in the metadata, then Jetty standard response producer will use that metadata as the HTTP response. But in this case, which in this case is 404, hopefully it won't reach this service. So the metadata response code will never be added as 404, and we'll use the default, which, if we go back to the producer, you may remember, is OK200. So hopefully that is everything we need. Let's apply the config. And here's what I set up earlier. We are running this on localhost 8080. And here's the URL we're going to set up. HTTP localhost on the same port, because it's using the same underlying Jetty engine as the GUI here. But now we're using the URL that we've set up, /API/name/. What we're hoping for is when I set this going, we should get an XML that reflects what we've set up. And it does. So hello world here has been converted to a piece of metadata called name, and in the static XML that we set up, it has put itself into the this element name here. URL has taken itself from Jetty URL, the metadata key that's provided by Jetty. We didn't set this up, it's automatically there, and it's put the whole URL here that's in the browser. If we decide for some reason we're going to change this to Dave Lister, Dave Lister there is now the name. So there you go. We've provided Interlok a Jetty instance. We've set Interlok up as a basic API web server, and that is how you can use Interlok as a basic HTTP web server.